I was 67 years old when I realized I had spent half my marriage feeling invisible. Not abused, not abandoned, just slowly forgotten. My name is Linda Brooks. I live in a small town outside of Dayton, Ohio. For 39 years, I was married to my husband, Frank. Frank worked as a mechanic almost his entire life. Quiet man, strong hands, oil stains that never fully disappeared from his fingers no matter how much soap he used. People always said we looked like a solid couple. And maybe from the outside, we did. We raised 2 daughters, paid our bills, went to church on Sundays, sat beside each other at family dinners. But somewhere over the years, we stopped truly seeing each other. I didn't notice it all at once. That's the dangerous thing about loneliness inside a marriage. It arrives quietly, one silent dinner at a time, one ignored sentence at a time, one "I'm tired" at a time, until one day you wake up next to someone you have loved for decades and feel completely alone. The morning everything changed started like any other. I woke up before sunrise. Frank was already sitting in the kitchen, coffee mug in his hand, television on low volume, Weather Channel, always the Weather Channel. I stood there for a moment, waiting for him to notice me. He didn't. I finally said softly, "Morning." Without turning around, he nodded. That was it. No smile, no question, no warmth, just a nod. I wish I could explain how painful small moments become at this age. When you're young, life is loud. Kids running through the house, jobs, appointments, noise everywhere. But after 60, the silence becomes louder than anything else. I made eggs that morning, placed his plate in front of him. He ate without speaking. Then he grabbed his keys. Before leaving, he finally looked at me. "You got mail on the counter," and then he walked out. I stood alone in the kitchen listening to the garage door close. That was the moment something inside me cracked. Not because of what he said, but because after nearly 40 years together, those were the only words we exchanged that morning. You start asking yourself strange questions when life becomes emotionally quiet. Would he notice if I disappeared for a few days? Would he miss me, or just miss having someone cook dinner? Maybe some of you understand this feeling too, especially after decades of marriage. At this age, people think loneliness only happens when someone dies, but sometimes loneliness happens while the person is still sitting right beside you. A week later, our oldest daughter, Rachel, came to visit. She brought soup and groceries. Typical Rachel, always taking care of everybody. While she unpacked things in the kitchen, she looked at me carefully. "Mama, you okay?" I smiled quickly. "Of course." But daughters know things, especially grown daughters. She lowered her voice. "You seem sad lately." I laughed it off. "I'm just getting older." But Rachel didn't smile. She glanced toward the garage where Frank was working on an old truck. "You and Dad still doing all right?" That question sat heavy inside my chest because I didn't know how to answer it anymore. Were we all right? We weren't fighting. We weren't cruel to each other, but we also weren't living like 2 people in love. We were existing beside each other, like roommates with shared history. That night, Rachel hugged me longer than usual before leaving, and after she drove away, I cried in the laundry room so Frank wouldn't hear me. I don't even know why I cried exactly. Maybe because someone finally noticed I wasn't okay, or maybe because I realized how long I had been pretending. A few days later, I found an old photo album while cleaning the hallway closet. Dust covered the edges. Inside were pictures from our younger years, camping trips, birthday parties, Christmas mornings. There was one photo that stopped me completely. Frank and me at a county fair in 1989. I was laughing, real laughing. My head leaned against his shoulder, and Frank was looking at me like I was the best thing in his world. I sat on the floor holding that picture for almost an hour. What happened to us? When did we stop touching each other? When did conversations turn into reminders about groceries and doctor appointments? When did marriage become so quiet? That evening, I decided to try, really try. I made Frank's favorite dinner, pot roast with mashed potatoes, lit a candle on the table. Not romantic exactly, just warm, hopeful. When he walked inside, he looked surprised. "What's all this for?" I smiled nervously. "Thought maybe we could eat together tonight." He sat down slowly. For a few minutes, things almost felt normal again. We talked about Rachel's kids, the weather, gas prices, simple things. Then I reached for his hand. Such a tiny thing, but it felt enormous. Frank froze. Not angry, not cruel, just uncomfortable. After a second, he gently pulled his hand away and grabbed his water glass. And in that tiny moment, my heart shattered more than I can explain. Because that small movement told me everything I had been trying not to admit. Somewhere, over the years, he had stopped reaching for me too. The rest of dinner passed quietly. Afterward, he went to the living room to watch television. I cleaned dishes alone, again. I remember staring at the kitchen window while rinsing plates. Outside, rain had started falling softly across the backyard. And suddenly, I realized something terrifying. I didn't know if Frank still loved me, or if we were simply too used to each other to leave. That thought stayed in my chest for days, like a heavy stone. Then one afternoon, everything became even worse. Because I found something inside Frank's truck, something I was never supposed to see. And after that moment, my entire marriage looked different. That afternoon started so normally. Frank had left early for work. I was outside watering flowers near the porch when dark clouds rolled in fast. Ohio weather changes quickly this time of year. A few minutes later, rain started pouring hard. I remembered Frank had left the windows cracked open in his truck. At first, I almost ignored it. Part of me thought, he can handle it himself. But after nearly 40 years of marriage, habits stay with you. You still protect people, even when they stop protecting your heart. I grabbed my cardigan and hurried through the rain toward the driveway. The truck smelled like motor oil and old coffee. I leaned across the seat to roll up the passenger window. That's when I saw it. A small white envelope tucked beside the center console, folded carefully. My name wasn't on it, but a woman's handwriting covered the front. Soft handwriting, neat, feminine. My stomach tightened instantly. I should have looked away. Maybe a stronger woman would have. But after months of feeling invisible, something inside me needed answers. I opened it slowly. Inside was a short note, only a few sentences, but those few sentences changed everything. Thank you for listening to me yesterday. I haven't laughed like that in years. You always make my day better. Claire. That was all. No hearts, no I love you, nothing obvious. But somehow that made it hurt even more, because emotional distance is sometimes more painful than physical betrayal. I sat frozen in the truck while rain hammered the windshield. Claire. I repeated the name in my head over and over. Who was Claire? A customer? A coworker? A friend? And why hadn't Frank laughed with me like that in years? I folded the note carefully and placed it back exactly where I found it. My hands were shaking. The entire walk back to the house felt unreal. I kept telling myself maybe I was overreacting, maybe it meant nothing. But deep down, women know when something inside a marriage has shifted. That evening, Frank came home around 6. Same routine, boots by the door, keys on the counter, television on. I watched him carefully while pretending to fold towels, trying to see him differently now, trying to imagine another woman making him smile. You okay? He asked suddenly. I almost laughed. After months of barely noticing me, he suddenly sensed something was wrong. I'm fine, I said quietly. He nodded and looked back at the TV. That was our marriage in one moment. 2 people hiding entire storms behind one-word answers. That night, I couldn't sleep. Frank snored softly beside me while my mind spun in circles. I kept imagining this Claire woman. Was she younger? Pretty? Did she laugh at his stories the way I used to? Did she ask him questions? Listen to him? Touch his arm when he talked? You start comparing yourself to strangers when your heart feels unsafe. At 67, that feeling becomes humiliating. Because society tells women our age we should stop caring, stop wanting romance, stop wanting emotional closeness. But that isn't true. At this age, love still matters deeply, maybe even more than before. Around 2 in the morning, I quietly got out of bed and sat in the kitchen alone. The refrigerator hummed softly. Rain still tapped against the windows. I wrapped both hands around a mug of tea and suddenly remembered something from years earlier, back when the girls were teenagers. Frank used to come home and search the house for me first, even before taking off his boots. Sometimes he'd wrap his arms around my waist while I cooked dinner. Sometimes he'd kiss the top of my head for no reason. We used to laugh together over stupid little things. Burnt pancakes, bad movies, inside jokes nobody else understood. Where did those people go? I honestly didn't know anymore. The next morning, I almost asked him about Claire. Almost. But fear stopped me. Not fear of anger, fear of confirmation. Because once truth enters a room, Life never goes back to the way it was before. Instead, I watched quietly. Over the next few days, I noticed things I had ignored before. Frank smiling down at his phone sometimes, leaving the room to answer calls, showering earlier than usual before work. Tiny things, small things, but together, they felt enormous. Then came our anniversary. 40 years. 40. I woke up hoping maybe things would feel different that day. Maybe he would remember who we once were. Maybe he would try. I even curled my hair, wore the blue sweater he always used to compliment years ago. I cooked a nice dinner again. Candles, soft music. Hope can make fools of us sometimes. Frank came home late, almost 8:30. He looked tired. When he saw the table, he stopped. Then his face changed slightly, like he had forgotten something important. And right there, before he even spoke, I knew. He forgot our anniversary. "Linda," he said softly, but I couldn't even look at him. 40 years together, and he forgot. I felt something collapse inside me right there in the dining room. Not dramatic, not explosive, just quiet heartbreak, the kind that slowly empties you. "I'm sorry," he whispered, but the apology came too late. I finally looked at him. "Who's Claire?" The room went completely still. Frank's face lost color instantly. That told me everything before he even answered. He sat down slowly at the table. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he rubbed his face with both hands and sighed deeply. "She works at the parts store." My chest tightened. "How long?" He looked exhausted suddenly. "Few months. Few months." I repeated those words silently while my heart pounded. "Are you sleeping with her?" Frank looked shocked. "No, God no. But you talk to her?" "Yes." "You laugh with her?" Silence. That silence hurt more than shouting ever could. I felt tears rising, but I forced them back. "What does she give you that I don't?" Frank looked at me for a long time, and when he finally answered, his words broke me completely. "She listens to me." I stared at him like a stranger, because after everything we survived together, after children, bills, sickness, funerals, years of sacrifice, our marriage was dying because somewhere along the way, we stopped listening to each other. And then Frank said something else, something that changed the entire direction of our lives. "I think we've both been lonely for a very long time. I think we've both been lonely for a very long time." Frank's words stayed hanging in the air between us. The candles on the table had almost burned out by then. Soft music still played from the little speaker near the kitchen counter. And there we were, two people married for 40 years, finally telling the truth for the first time in ages. I should have screamed, maybe thrown something. That's what younger people do in movies. But heartbreak at 67 feels different, quieter, heavier, more tired. I sat down slowly across from him. My hands felt cold. "When did this happen to us?" I asked softly. Frank stared at the table for a long moment before answering. "I don't know." And honestly, I believed him. Because marriages rarely fall apart in one dramatic moment. Usually they fade slowly. Tiny cracks, tiny silences, tiny disappointments, until one day strangers are sleeping in the same bed. Frank looked older that night, not physically, emotionally, like he had been carrying something heavy for years. "She talks to me during lunch breaks sometimes," he admitted quietly. "That's all." I nodded slowly. "And you enjoy that more than being here with me?" He closed his eyes briefly. "That's not what I meant, but it's true." Again, silence. Painful silence. The kind married couples understand without words. I stood up and began clearing the table because I didn't know what else to do with my body. Frank tried helping me. For years I had wanted him to notice me in small moments like that, but now his kindness almost hurt more. "Linda." I kept washing dishes. "I never meant to hurt you." I laughed softly, not a happy laugh, just tired. "You stopped trying not to." That sentence hit him hard. I could see it in his face, because deep down, he knew it was true. We stopped protecting each other emotionally a long time ago. That night we slept facing opposite directions. The space between us felt enormous. I barely slept. Around 4 in the morning, I heard Frank quietly crying. At first I thought I imagined it, but then I heard it again, soft, hidden, the kind of crying men do when they think nobody can hear them. And suddenly my anger became confused with sadness, because for the first time in years, I realized Frank was hurting too. The next few weeks felt strange, like two people standing carefully inside broken glass. We became polite with each other again. Too polite. Need anything from the store? You want coffee? Did you take your medicine? Surface level kindness. But underneath, something painful remained unfinished. Rachel noticed quickly. One afternoon, she came over unexpectedly. Frank was outside fixing the fence. Rachel stood beside me in the kitchen while I sliced apples. "What happened?" she asked quietly. I froze. "Mama, don't do that thing where you pretend everything's fine." I looked down at the cutting board. Sometimes grown children see through us easier than anyone else. I finally whispered, "There's another woman." Rachel's eyes widened instantly. "What?" I explained everything slowly. The letter, the conversations, the anniversary, Frank's confession. By the end, Rachel looked heartbroken too. But then she surprised me. "Do you think Dad loves her?" I opened my mouth quickly to say yes, but the truth stopped me. Because deep down, I didn't think that was the real problem. The real problem was something worse. We had stopped loving each other properly long before Claire appeared. Claire was just where Frank's loneliness went. Rachel sat quietly for a moment. Then she asked softly, "Do you still love Dad?" That question nearly destroyed me, because the answer was yes. And maybe that was the most painful part of all. I still loved him, even after the hurt, even after the distance, even after feeling invisible for years. Love after decades doesn't disappear neatly. It stays tangled inside memories, inside routines, inside ordinary moments. A few days later, Frank knocked gently on the bedroom door while I was folding clothes. "We should talk." I almost said no, but something in his voice sounded fragile, so I nodded. We sat in the living room together. No TV, no distractions, just us, like strangers learning how to speak again. Frank rubbed his hands together nervously. I stopped feeling important here. That sentence shocked me. I stared at him. "You?" He nodded slowly. "You needed me for things. Bills, repairs, responsibilities. But after the girls moved out," he swallowed hard, "I started feeling like you didn't actually want me around anymore." I couldn't believe what I was hearing, because that was exactly how I felt too. For years, how could two people live inside the same marriage, both feeling unwanted, without realizing the other person felt the same? Maybe some marriages don't die from hate. Maybe they die from silence. Frank looked at me carefully. "You stopped touching me too, Linda." I opened my mouth to argue, then stopped, because he was right. At some point, I stopped reaching for him, stopped initiating hugs, stopped trying after being emotionally ignored so many times. We had both slowly retreated from each other, like two wounded people waiting for the other person to make the first move, and neither of us did. That evening became the first real conversation we'd had in years. Not perfect, not magical, painful, honest. We talked for nearly 3 hours about loneliness, about aging, about retirement, about becoming invisible after 60. Frank admitted he was terrified of getting older, terrified of becoming useless, terrified that life had become routine until death. And suddenly I saw something clearly. The woman at the part store wasn't the true issue. The real issue was that both of us had been emotionally starving for years. Claire simply noticed his existence when I had become too exhausted to keep trying. And maybe another man could have easily noticed mine too. That realization humbled me deeply. Before bed, Frank stood awkwardly near the hallway. Then very carefully, like someone handling something fragile, he reached for my hand. The same hand he pulled away from during our anniversary dinner. This time, I didn't move. His fingers trembled slightly around mine. Such a tiny moment. But after months of emotional distance, it felt enormous. Still, part of me remained scared. Because rebuilding trust at 67 feels terrifying. You start wondering if it's too late, too much damage, too many lost years. And then, 3 nights later, I overheard something that made my heart stop again. Frank was outside on the porch talking on the phone, and I heard him say Claire's name. The moment I heard Claire's name, my stomach dropped. I stood frozen near the hallway window, while rain tapped softly against the porch roof outside. Frank's voice stayed low, calm, careful. "I can't talk like this anymore," he said. A long silence followed. Then he spoke again. "No, "It's not your fault." My chest tightened painfully. Part of me wanted to storm outside. Another part of me was terrified to hear more. At 67, heartbreak doesn't make you dramatic. It makes you tired. I leaned against the wall quietly and listened. Frank sighed heavily. I should have fixed my marriage years ago. My breathing stopped for a second. Then finally, he said goodbye and ended the call. I quickly stepped away before he came inside. A few moments later, he entered the kitchen slowly. When he saw me standing there, he knew instantly I had heard enough. Neither of us spoke at first. Then Frank quietly placed his phone on the counter. I ended it. I searched his face carefully. Not because I didn't believe him, because I was afraid to. "You cared about her," I whispered. Frank nodded honestly. I cared that someone listened. That answer hurt, but it was truthful. And after years of silence between us, truth mattered more than comfort. He sat down heavily at the kitchen table. I never planned for any of this. I crossed my arms tightly around myself. Neither did I. For a long moment, we simply looked at each other. Two older people carrying decades of love, disappointment, regret, and exhaustion. Then Frank said something I never expected. "I think we forgot how to be husband and wife after the girls left." Tears burned my eyes instantly, because that was exactly it. For years, we had focused on surviving life. Working, raising children, paying bills, handling emergencies. Then suddenly one day, the house became quiet. The girls grew up, retirement started creeping closer, and without all the noise around us, we were finally forced to face the emotional distance we had ignored for years. Many couples never talk about this part of aging, the loneliness that can enter a marriage after children leave, the silence, the routines, the feeling that life slowly becomes smaller. At this age, people don't always need grand romance. Sometimes they just need to feel emotionally seen again. That night, Frank and I talked until almost 2 a.m. No yelling, no blaming, just honesty. Painful honesty. He admitted there were moments he felt invisible too, moments he thought I no longer respected him, no longer admired him, and I admitted how deeply unwanted I had felt for years, how every silent dinner slowly broke something inside me, how forgotten anniversaries hurt more at 67 than they ever would have at 30. Because at this age, you realize time is limited. You stop wanting someday. You want connection now, healing now, love now. Around midnight, Frank suddenly looked at me with tears in his eyes, real tears. "I don't want to lose you, Linda." And after everything, those words still reached my heart. That surprised me most of all, because no matter how hurt I had been, part of me still wanted us to find each other again. Healing did not happen overnight. I wish I could say the next morning everything became perfect. It didn't. Some days were awkward, some conversations reopened old wounds, some moments still felt fragile. Trust rebuilds slowly, especially after decades of emotional neglect. But little things started changing, real things. Frank began eating breakfast at the table again instead of in front of the television. He started asking me questions, not surface questions, real ones. "How are you feeling today? What are you thinking about?" Sometimes we sat on the porch together without speaking, but now the silence felt peaceful instead of lonely. One afternoon, he brought home flowers. Not expensive ones, just grocery store flowers. But I nearly cried when I saw them, because it meant he was thinking about me again. Weeks later, Rachel visited and stopped suddenly in the kitchen. She looked back and forth between us suspiciously. "Okay, what changed?" Frank actually laughed, a real laugh, the kind I hadn't heard in years, and without thinking, I smiled back. That moment felt strange and beautiful at the same time, like finding an old song you thought you forgot forever. Even when life becomes repetitive, even when aging changes everything, even when silence becomes easier than effort. Frank reached for my hand that afternoon near the empty fairgrounds, and this time, he held on tightly. Maybe some people would say our marriage was damaged forever. Maybe they'd be right. But healing doesn't always mean returning to who you once were. Sometimes healing means finally becoming honest enough to love each other properly for the first time in years. I'm 67 now, and yes, I was heartbroken. Deeply heartbroken. But strangely, that heartbreak forced us to finally wake up before it was too late. And maybe that's the lesson I want to leave behind. Sometimes marriages don't collapse because love disappears. Sometimes they collapse because two lonely people stop speaking their pain out loud. And if you're still sitting beside someone you once loved deeply, maybe tonight is the night to finally start talking again.